Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is being presented by Entersekt and Aite-Novarica Group. Today's presenters are Dewald Nolte, the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Entersekt, and Julie Conroy, who is the head of risk insights and advisory for the Aite-Novarica Group. Before we begin, I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping topics. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself, and please share it with your colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions, so please look at the Q&A chat box on the screen, and if you think of a question for the speakers at any point, just type it in there and we'll hold it for the discussion portion at the end of the event. So at this time, I'm going to hand over to our panelists to start today's presentation. So over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Debbie, for the introduction. And Julie, thank you for being here. Great to see you. And just as to kind of start, I read your blog in terms of your experience that you had, and with checkout, e-commerce kind of being a challenge that probably a lot of us has dealt with over the years in some way, shape, or form. We probably all run into a similar experience, and so wanted to kind of just kick off the conversation about talking about that experience. Just what happened there?
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, so as somebody that has been in the fraud and authentication space for most of my career, I tend to be pretty forgiving when I have friction because I understand where it's coming from. But in this case, I was so irritated by the friction that I was moved to blog about it. I was buying some soccer tickets or football tickets, depending on your continent. And so it was English Premier League. It was an unusual purchase. And so initially my issuer declined the transaction. And then they immediately sent me a two-way text, said, is this you? I said it was. They said, retry the transaction. And if they'd approved it then, it would have been great. I would have felt protected. I would have understood, it was an unusual purchase. But the back end systems weren't talking to one another. And so when I retried my transaction, they put me through 3D Secure, which again, being in the industry, I understood what was going on in the background. I got a one-time password to the same number that they had sent the two-way text to. I put the one-time passcode in, and they declined me again.
Oh, wow.
And so now I was quite irritated, and I called the contact center because that was my last option at this point. Waited on hold as you always do, and finally got to somebody. They, put me through some very remedial, knowledge-based authentication questions to authenticate me, and I authenticated, and then she still couldn't help me. And so after 45 minutes, she had to walk down the hall, get her supervisor. They finally approved me. I've been a client of this issuer for 25 years. And by the time I finally was able to get back on the site and try my transaction again, I had lost the tickets that I initially wanted. Somebody else got them. And so I finally got them, but the seats weren't as good. So it was just a bad experience all the way around. And I will say that card is now firmly back of wallet for me.
And it's such an incredible story because I had a similar experience with a colleague where we were trying to kind of buy tickets for a F1 race that we wanted to kind of attend, and I think same experience there where tried to use the card, got declined, was on the contact center, and even with the assistance of the contact center agent, we're not able to actually resolve it after a number of hours of trying to do this. And I think even with that said, it ended up where we had to use a different card. And I think that's the point that we want to make here is I think if you look at the state of the industry and if you look at kind of the obsession with user experience and removing friction from it. What's happening really, which is quite, I think, the opposite probably of what they're trying to do, or what we're trying to achieve probably as a financial industry, is that in trying to remove all the fraud, well, not the fraud really, the friction rather, we're actually creating more friction. Because I think, if we take the experience that you had, I had when I tried to kind of book the F1 tickets, it's an interesting thing there where when the cards declined the first time, there's no real input that you had. Well, in your case, you kind of had, I guess, some other challenges as well. But I think the point kind of being there that if you are experiencing that as a consumer, right, where you don't actually have the power to influence the result, that is actually quite a terrible experience, and you feel powerless. And to your point, you firmly place that card in the back of the wallet, and you're never going back to that card online based on that experience. And I think what was quite interesting to kind of see that is, the survey that you did kind of reflects the same experience back, or kind of the same result back, right? It seems that if we look at these stats that we've got on the screen, we're not the only ones feeling that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this survey data, we actually just pulled it out of the field. So this is one of the first groups that are actually getting to see this. But, this is actually a refresh of a survey that we did back in 2018, looking at the attitudes towards authentication and fraud experiences among consumers across a few different geographies. And as you can see here, 73% of US consumers, blame the issuer when this happens. And I thought, this was actually particularly interesting when you compare it to the survey results that we did back in 2018, because back then it was more mixed. It was pretty much a 50-50 split, that the consumer was equally frustrated with both the merchant and the issuer. And now I think there's a realization that those authorizations ultimately come from the issuer, and so that's it's that card that they get frustrated with more so than the e-commerce merchant.
Absolutely. And I think the result pretty much kind of being, as we mentioned, that the card kind of I guess best case scenario for the bank, the card goes back of wallet for e-commerce, and worst case, we even see the consumer leaving the bank completely. I know I've seen this in a number of the stories that we have where it's actually resulted in that. And I think I was quite surprised to see that number kind of being as high as a third that would consider moving banks, if you have that bad experience.
Yeah, because I mean, it's not always easy to move banks. Although if it's a credit card, it's certainly easier than if it's your current account or your checking account. But yeah, 1 in 3 said that if they continue to have these false decline issues with credit cards, they're going to switch. And similarly, there's a lack of forgiveness if fraud actually happens. Half of folks say that if fraud happens on their account, that could be the thing that prompts them to move as well. So it's a tough position that banks are in, because you've got to be right on both sides of the equation. You can't put the false declines, or as some call them, the customer insults, into the equation, but you've also got to catch the fraud.
Absolutely. And I think for me that's an interesting point, and something I've been thinking about a little bit. If you think about friction, from a consumer's point of view, and if we look at the slide up here, we're also kind of seeing that friction remains a big, friction at checkout remains a big problem, right? A lot of revenue lost and card abandonments kind of resulting as if you get it wrong. So an interesting perspective on that is that the obsession when it comes to friction and removing it completely. I think something that I kind of realized when I was thinking through my own experience, and certainly yours that's similar to that, is that I guess friction is a bit of it's like a dial that you can move. You can never really remove it from a consumer's journey. It's you can move it, and based on that you can actually optimize the impact of it, but you can never completely take that away. And what I mean by that is, let's take an example where if I check out and you have, for example, step-up authentication that happens. That might be something right at the front of the at the start of the user journey that's maybe considered to be friction by a user. The fact that I have to do step-up authentication, it didn't just go automatically through. Versus if you dial it all the way to say, well, we're never going to challenge you, we're just going to try and make it frictionless. The friction then is removed from the front of the user journey. But actually what happens then is, in these cases where there's a false decline and you're not challenging, well, in that case now, because declined, and as a consumer, I'm left to say, well, okay, it's not a decline. What do I do? Now I have to call the call center. And then the frictions in that process, right? I have to go and sit in a call center queue, and I have to speak to an agent to try and unblock that and try and help me through that. And so it seems that there's almost a bit of a balance and a dial that you kind of need to I guess walk the line from an issuer point of view to get that balance right. What would you say on that front?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Yeah, the buzzword in our industry right now is frictionless, but I think it's more appropriately we should be thinking about friction right, the right sort of friction at the right time. Because again, in my experience, when I got that two-way text, and it was a super unusual transaction for me, I was feeling protected. It's like, okay, they've got my back here because they've detected that this is very unusual. It's when they screwed up the second and the third time that I got really irritated because they didn't have one system talking to the other. But a certain level of friction for the transactions is appropriate, and I think consumers, merchants for sure, as well as issuers, would welcome it if we could get friction right. Because as you look at, we've done a lot of research in this space, and you see consistently that CNP transactions, on average, have about 82 to 85% authorization rates. Varies a little bit depending on the payment network.
Yeah.
Point of sale, we're consistently 97, 98% plus. Now,
yes,
there is higher risk in CNPs, so some of those declines are fraud, but not the 13% delta that we have today. So if we can get friction right, then we could potentially narrow that gap of those false declines that are happening and make everybody in the ecosystem much happier.
And an interesting thing on that, Julie, that you're touching on right now is, why is that gap so big? And I think there's probably a clue in the slide that we've got up right now, in the sense that, I always think about consumer preference, right? And consistency of checkout experience, playing a big role in that. I think if you look at, for example, your card present transactions that has that very high, success rate, one of the reasons being like, look, it's tried and tested. It's consumers know exactly what to do, and it's the same, whether I go to Target or whether I go to Walmart, paying with my card is a fairly similar experience, versus when it is online, it's vastly different, because there are a lot of players. It's how the merchant obviously, displays, or what that user journey looks like, the issuer's authentication piece, how they actually do that. There's a lot that can go wrong there and can be different, and I think that's probably playing a big role. And so the other thing that's quite interesting about that is, if you look at consumer preference, I always think about the role that plays. If I were to use your phone today, right, I would probably be very frustrated, even though for you it's probably set up very well and you can navigate it with ease. And I think the point there being that, even though your phone might be, arguably better or more efficiently set up than mine, my experience would be bad because it wasn't set up according to my preference. And so when it comes to consumer experience, having that optionality that for user preference becomes a very big role in how that consumer experience is. And we can see that even from the stats on the screen, there is, if you look at the preference, there is a very big difference. A lot of consumers, for example, still preferring username and password. I was very surprised to kind of see that, considering all the data breaches that that consumers kind of still feel safe with only username and password as an example. But you can also see then biometrics starting to kind of, I guess, become a bit more prevalent. But taking a step back and looking at that to say, if you're able to, as a consumer, influence and I guess curate the consumer experience to take into account your preference, that really makes it a big difference in terms of your user experience. And it might be, for example, that the dial that if we go back to the dial that I mentioned about how to turn it, it might be that you choose to always get challenged, right? That might be your preference, whereas my preference might be that I want to be challenged only during certain times, but I want to be challenged in a specific way as well, right? And so I think bringing that preference in might be a way to really kind of help us to bridge that 13% gap.
I think it is, and we can certainly, as we give consumers these choices, we can take away username password.
Sure.
It's
yes.
not secure, even though consumers, it's actually a double whammy. In the survey, consumers not only had a preference for username password, a distressing, percentage of them, but also the equivalent percentage still think that username password is really effective, which means that they've got a very false sense of security when they're transacting. But we also saw, one of the stats was, and it's up here on the screen, is 65% of consumers want to have options to choose from and want to control the way in which they are authenticated. And I think if we can enable that and empower them with that, not only does that make the customer experience much better and help to get to friction right, but it also creates another point of stickiness. So as you are thinking about leaving your financial institution, and you're thinking about unwinding your bill pay and everything else, it's also unwinding these authentication preferences, and someplace else might not enable that. So I think having putting this choice in customers' hands is a really important way to achieve two goals: improving the customer experience and reducing fraud by getting to a friction right state.
And that's an interesting point, Julian. And certainly we recently did a deployment for an access control, so a 3D secure implementation at a large issuer. And what was interesting about that is, we brought in some changes. We brought in some consistency, of the authentication capabilities, using consistent authentication mechanisms for, what they use on one channel versus the other, right? Bringing that into a consistent story across all the channels. And then the other thing, we enabled that choice, right? That real-time choice and that preference for the consumers to set that. And what we saw was, we saw that they reduced their fraud by 75% by implementing that authentication there, and they increased their conversion rates by, I think, something like 25% uplift in their their success rates. And the reason for that being that the consumers obviously had the ability to kind of choose their preference, and so they started trusting it. They were really happy and felt safe online. So the fraud piece, with that reduction of fraud, obviously really helping them to kind of gain the trust of the users, and then the consistency of experience and the ability to choose that preference, really being a kind of bringing that conversion rate to be higher. And certainly from a bank's point of view, I mean, the uplift in revenue there, of course, very much appreciated there. But I think what was really key for us and really interesting to notice there is that the consumers, if you look at the stats, if you look at how they set up, it was vastly different. But what we did there, and which I think is a great thing that the industry should consider and certainly look into, because the technology is available, is to make that capability available, right, to the users, to make that choice available to them, with the I guess the asterisk to say, keep the options that are available to the user, of course, secure, right? So, for example, give them options, but not username and password, as an example,
Yes, absolutely. And you know, I love so many of the metrics that you just cited there. And you know, the consumer choice piece is so important, because as you look at some of the more secure authenticators, you know, biometrics, you know, in the study we just did, we saw consumers' comfort level with biometrics and engagement with them increased significantly since 2018. And you know, we have Apple and Google to thank for that. They've, you know, kind of brought that into mainstream for us. But you know, you look at just different demographics, and we slice the data by age group, and you know, seniors are much less comfortable with fingerprint biometrics, because as you age, your fingerprints start wearing off, and it just doesn't work as well. And so, giving folks the opportunity to select what works well for them, what they're comfortable with, is a critical point to that customer journey and that customer experience. I think another point that you made that I want to just double click on is having that consistency of authentication across channels is also really important, just so you have a uniform experience with the bank, but also having the ability to have those authentication experiences talk to one another in the background at the bank. Because again, you know, going back to my experience, if those channels had been talking to one another and the ACS server at my bank had realized that I had successfully authenticated by two-way text, I wouldn't have gotten declined that second time, and the blog never would have happened.
No, and it is so important to kind of get that right. And I think, you know, Julie, a couple of things that kind of, you know, working in the industry and some of the things that get me excited. I think if you look at 3D Secure and the way that was, you know, implemented, the version 1 of the protocol, I think an absolute disaster, right? I think what you're kind of seeing in the industry is pretty much people doing anti 3D Secure 1, right? Like literally trying to find ways around it because it wasn't really solving the problem. But I think what's happened and what gets me excited is that if you look at the technology today, there definitely seems to be the ability to kind of bring that experience, you know, to something that is consistent across a number of channels, not challenges. And I think the thing that's maybe a good example of that, it's going, you know, it's consistent across your channels, for example, at your bank, but also starting to kind of become consistent even across channels in terms of digital versus in person. So I think if you take something like your tap to pay with your phone wallets today, I can use, you know, if I'm checking out, for example, on e-commerce, right, being able to use a biometric to check out online versus paying in store, you know, with a wallet and using a biometric there. You can see that's starting to also happen, right? And I think that consistency, even across in-person versus you know, e-commerce, is also something that I'm really excited about, to really kind of create for users a journey that is good all around and really sets us up for success, because there's nothing worse than you know, getting to the point where you kind of want to check out and then having to jump through all kinds of hoops and doing it for the first time and having to figure out, you know, what's really going on here. You at some point you just go, you know, this isn't for me. And I think that really the fact that the technology capabilities are there to actually start converge these journeys and really enable that consistent and good user experiences is something that I get excited about. And certainly I'm excited to kind of see the industry start to adopt that, to actually bring the value back to it, so that we're not trying to actually get around it, but actually use it to make the experience better.
Absolutely. We've been talking about omni-channel for so many years, and it was very much kind of a just hypothetical buzzword for a long time, but we're actually starting to see some real world implementations of this finally. And it's great both from a CX perspective, but also as you have that increasingly holistic view of your customer and their behavior patterns, it also is super powerful from a risk management perspective.
I was encouraged to see, and maybe I'm interpreting this wrong, Julie, but I'll choose to see it that way in any way. To see that when we looked at your password, username and password and biometric stats, that the biometric one was one higher than the username password. So the passportless future that we're all kind of driving towards, it does seem that we're starting to kind of get at least to a point where we're starting to get some momentum.
Finally, it's been a long time coming. We just have that 35% of consumers that we've got to get some education out to them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much, Julie. It was great to have you and to share your experiences and the stats of your research really was fascinating for me, and learned a lot from that. And I think if there's any questions, we could probably take that.
I look forward to hearing the questions from the audience. So why don't we move on to that segment?